right. So you're gonna handle the people waiting to join?
Yep, I'll take care of all that.
Super duper. Well, I'm gonna start slow since I know we have people coming in over the next few minutes. Want to introduce myself. I am, my name is Morgan Estes. I am a WordPress contributor. I think I counted up, I've got like 15 releases of core that I've contributed to. I'm a plugin author, and for the past several years, I've been a plugin and theme author for a couple different agencies and groups. I originally started building WordPress stuff, and I would write all my code and then push it off to FTP and pray it worked, and killed a lot of servers that way. I did the great thing of like modifying theme files and then later on updating the theme and losing all of my customizations. Good times. And then I started cowboy coding, what we call it. And that's where I didn't have a local environment. I just had our production and staging environments. And I would open up Dreamweaver and connect via FTP over to the server on production. And then I started using staging, but it's same deal. I would go FTP and just start modifying files directly. And that's okay when you're one person, and that's okay when you're doing simple edits. Then I ran into issues like PHP is not friendly. And so if you miss a semicolon, you white screen your entire site. And good luck trying to figure out what happened. Other issues I ran into were there were configurations in production that I didn't have available to me. And so when I started doing local development or FTP, or there was no way for me to match exactly what production had for me. And then good things like I learned the power of step debugging and using Xdebug to step through my code, and learned I can't do that on a remote machine anymore. It's possible, but painful. So over the past, 5 years, I've started looking more and more into local development options. And when I mean local, I'm specifically referring to things like spinning up a actual server on my machine so that I can test my code without breaking anything else in production. And that can be kind of painful, because what if I don't have a machine that perfectly matches? So for a long time, I was on a Windows machine, Windows computer, and Windows and PHP don't really play well. And then Windows on IIS doesn't play well, especially when all my production servers were on Linux or Red Hat or some other weird Unix version that I could not replicate. And started figuring out also, when I'm working with a team, my team needs to be able to replicate the way that we work. Along with my local development workflow, and I'm going to pause here for a minute. This is not just a, let me show you everything I do. There's going to be a lot of, let me show you what I do. But this is perfect time for Q&A. If there's at any moment you say, hey, I've got a question about the thing you just said, then I don't know, if just unmute and chat or raise your hand. How do you want to handle that?
Either unmute or I will monitor the chat. So if anyone has any questions, put them there and I can interrupt.
fantastic. And as back up a little bit, this is a super nerdy developer focused talk. But if you're not a developer, you can still learn from this, because this is one way that I use to vet other developers that I'm working with. Because if they don't have a plan for how they're going to test and develop things, then that means they're going to run the risk of breaking my site in production if it's not tested fully. So here I am, I'm on a team. I have production servers, I have things working, and I need to be able to locally develop so that I'm free to experiment. I'm free to test. Along with my local development process, I also got heavily involved into Git workflows and version controlling all of my code, and being able to share what I've done with other people. And sometimes that other people is myself months from now. Being able to do that, I use Git for all of my stuff. There's lots of discussions of whether or not you should version control like your themes and plugins and core, and I'll leave that up to you. Personally, I only version control the stuff that I'm writing, but with a workflow that I'll show you today, we also have core and theme and plugins all part of our Git repo. So let me start off by running down when I'm looking for local development environments, which I'll be honest, I use multiple. There's a couple that I use more than anything, but I use what I need. When I do that, I'm going to show you my screen maybe. There, share screen. All right. When I am looking at what I'm going to do, by the way, this slideshow is hastily thrown together in WordPress using the Gutenberg block editor. I have certain requirements. My requirements has got to be easy to install, easy to set up. Easy is kind of relative, but easy is someone's got to do all the work for me. I just have to install something and have it working out of the box. Minimal prerequisites. And for me, minimal is I shouldn't have to go and hunt down 5 different pieces of software to install before I can use a tool. I want to be effective out of the box. Some things I already use are things like Docker for virtual environments. I use Composer and Xdebug and WP-CLI. I use Node, several different versions of that, depending on which project I'm on. There are certain things that I already have. But if you're just starting out and you don't have all that stuff, that shouldn't stop you from being able to start something. And then I want to be able to reproduce my production environment. That one is key for me. And what I mean by that is I want a PHP version that is running on my live server on my local computer, because I need to know, as PHP is changing, if something that I'm writing is going to break in production. I need to know locally before I push it to production. I need to know that code that I'm writing will be able to run because a module exists on production. I need it to exist locally. I need caching. If my remote service has caching and I'm leveraging caching, I need that to be able to run locally. And I run all of my websites with full TLS, SSL. I need to be able to do that same thing locally to know that code that I'm using doesn't somehow affect whether or not I have certificates installed. So three pretty basic requirements for me, but I'm flexible on some of those things. My nice to haves. I use WP-CLI. I use the terminal quite a bit. WP-CLI is a command line interface with WordPress that lets you do things like update all of your plugins, make backups, migrate sites, all through the command line. It's a lot faster than using the interface, the WordPress admin. And it lets you script it a little bit so you can have a whole bunch of custom commands, which I do. Said I want TLS. If I don't have it, it's not going to break me because there's very little that I do that doesn't, that crosses across and says, okay, it has to be SSL. I want to be able to share my site over a network. That's beneficial because I work remotely now, as like 99% of the world right now. So being able to share locally the stuff that I'm working on and have someone in another location be able to look at my computer is really great because I can get quick feedback on that. I don't have to push it up to some other remote server, have them log into that, walk them through it. I can just say, hey, look at my computer right now. Working with a team or working with myself, I want to be able to share my configuration. That's either the site have a file that says, okay, here's a file, spin it from that, or here's a copy of the site that I have, install it on your server or on your computer and start working with it. I love the command line, but I also am a very visual person. So I prefer things that have a graphic interface, the GUI. And as I said, Xdebug. PHP, JavaScript, I love console log, and I love var dumps all throughout my code. But that only gets me so far. Being able to click on a breakpoint and step through the line by line of code to know where did that function get called, what else is happening to it. Xdebug is just invaluable for that. I'm going to say I can't place a price on it because I can donate to the author of Xdebug. It's open source and support open source. So those are my requirements, my wants. So here are the candidates. These are ones that I have used, that I've used over the years, that I now use, that I recommend, or ones that I've just learned about and want to try. There are some that aren't on this list that I'll point out a couple that are some special cases. Desktop server. Anyone familiar or use desktop server? Okay. So desktop server has a free and a paid version and will let you quickly spin up a WordPress site and install some plugins right off the bat that help in development. MAMP or WAMP, that's the classic. MAMP goes old school, and that lets you set up, again, server, different things. Those things both install their own set of software and run it inside their sandboxes. Local is a GUI that formerly was Local by Flywheel. They changed the way that they wrote things and they rebranded. And this is actually the third rebranding of Local. Local by Flywheel. Local was another program. Flywheel, the hosting company, bought the team and bought the software from Local. They're still working on it. And Local, or Flywheel, then was purchased by WP Engine. And so Local, there's a lot of hosting companies that are now starting to release tools that work very closely with their hosting environments. Along with that, Kinsta has recently released one called Dev Kinsta, and it looks very much like Local and works very much the same way. Lando and DDev Local are both very similar. They're command line driven, and they're kind of just front ends for Docker Compose. And then for core development, just straight up WordPress, the two are WordPress Develop and VVV. So VVV is Varying Vagrants and has been around for a long time. It's built on Vagrant as a virtualization platform instead of Docker. And these two are designed to help create environments that are matched to WordPress developers. So if you're interested in contributing to core, you'll see these a lot at contributor days. Also, if you're doing theme or plugin development that you're going to release to the public, developing on these environments is really good because you get the latest source version and you can test things, your stuff, on the next version of WordPress before it's released. So,
Hey Morgan, Ryan had a question. Any resources on learning Xdebug? I've tried to stab at it a few times, but always get hung up on setup.
Yeah, setup is rough. I'll be honest with you about that. I've had a really hard time setting up Xdebug. And the Xdebug docs don't always help. Things that I've gone to are like WordPress, Make WordPress Core has some info. But I'm going to show you a trick that has really helped me when it comes to Xdebug, and it might help you. So I'm going to take a look at Desktop Server and personally immediately reject it. So I installed Desktop Server several years ago and it was really great. I installed it just this week or last week and realized that it is a black box. I don't know what it's doing. One of the great things is it has blueprints where you can say, okay, here's a standard way of installing things, but I couldn't find a way to modify anything. I couldn't find a way to use WP CLI. I couldn't find a way to really test my code. And I have no idea what it installed. It doesn't tell me what it's running on. And that's too much of a black box for my needs. I couldn't set it to a modern version of PHP. They get installed version 7.2. And if you haven't been following PHP, version 8.0 has been released. 7.2 no longer gets updates. And 7.4 is the most recent 7 release. And there was no way for me to upgrade to a newer version of PHP when using Desktop Server. That made it immediate. Those are things that don't work for me. MAMP and WAMP. So let's take a look at this. If you go to the MAMP website, MAMP is built on XAMPP. Let's see. I'm guessing, you all can't see my This is so weird. I don't know how to share multiple screens. So it looks like I have to stop. And then I can't just share my screen, can I?
It doesn't let you share the whole desktop.
I tried, and maybe I'm messing that up. It gave me like individual windows. Oh, hold shift to do multiple windows. Maybe. So now it's sharing 5 windows. Do you see one at a time, or do you see all 5?
We see local right now.
Okay. Then how about MAMP?
Yep.
Okay. Yay. MAMP has a trial version of Pro, and that's what I'm showing you right now. It's built on XAMPP, which is an old virtualization platform, and it's really stable. MAMP Pro has a nice one-click create a new host, and it'll let me. This is awesome. In sharing multiple windows, I've lost my mouse. I love technology. Okay. I'm going to pause sharing for a moment. See if somehow I can get my mouse back. I need help.
I don't have a good answer, unfortunately.
Do you have a way to kill my sharing?
I can probably do that. Okay, there you go.
Right. That did not that did not give me my mouse back. So, all right, I'm going to go a little bit wild here and just hope I'm clicking the right things.
Okay, I think we may have lost Morgan. I don't think he clicked the right thing. Hopefully he will join us in just a minute. There we go.
I did not click the right thing.
All right, you're co-host again.
Okay. Okay. Thanks y'all for being patient. I'm doing all this right now without actually having a mouse. So like I can click on things, but I have no idea where it is at any moment. So I'm going to show you MAMP is probably the most flexible tool that I use. And one of the requirements that I had was it's easy to install, absolutely is, and it can match my production environment. So I want to show you what I have here is I've spun up a quick WordPress install, But the environment, let's say the environment I'm trying to match is my WP Engine environment. And WP Engine uses Apache as its backend. It uses Nginx as a front caching system, and that's super proprietary way they've got that running. They have Memcached as the caching layer that I have access to, and they provide WP CLI and MySQL. Well, with MAMP Pro, I have the ability to, over here on the side, I've got Apache. I have MySQL. I can pick the version. Right now, most of my sites are on PHP 7.4, but I do have some that are on PHP 7.3. And I need to test on 7.4 before I can upgrade them safely. I have Memcached as the back end, and I also have Redis enabled because I want to be able to switch between the two depending on which environment that I'm testing. And another fun thing about MAMP is in the languages side with PHP, it lets me preset the PHP versions with specific modules enabled. And so I know what modules WordPress needs, and so does it. So when it starts up a new WordPress site, it's going to enable PHP with the basics that WordPress needs. But I also know from WP Engine's docs what modules are installed there. And I could go into MAMP and I can specifically configure the PHP to match. I know they're using Memcached on the back end for their caching and not Redis. It's about the same, but because there is slight differences, I want to be able to test on what those differences are. And new sites that get spun up with WP Engine or Flywheel now seem to be going to MySQL 8. My sites, because I have a dedicated server, they're still on MySQL 7. So I have the ability in MySQL to pick which version I have and make sure that everything is configured. This is the absolutely nerdiest part of it, because this is, I can drill down to every specific feature and enable, disable, change, do anything I want with just a couple clicks. And so I've set up this environment, and no idea how to switch to another screen. So as an aside, not having a mouse is really tough on me, but also Mac's accessibility tools are kind of crap because I want to use my keyboard and can't because Mac doesn't let me actually dive into the things that I need to. So let me show you what I got. I got my mouse back. So with MAMP, I spun it up, and in less than 5 minutes, I had a full WordPress install, and here it is. Go into my dashboard, notice it's running. It's got its own port. It's not going to conflict with some things, but I can now go in and install all my software or all my plugins, themes, everything. And when I'm developing, these are all on a local file system. So I could go in and just start making changes to it. One of the nice things about MAMP that I don't love but it really does help, is it has a built-in editor. Okay, so now that I have my mouse back, I can show you. You can quickly switch, and it has version 8, but you can quickly switch PHP versions. So as you're testing things, you can tell, okay, this server that I'm coming from has 7.3, the server I'm going to has 7.4, and you can quickly switch and see what's there. MAMP has a nice built-in editor. So this is not my preferred way of doing it, but if I were to come in and want to edit a plugin, then I can go in and create my plugin and start editing it and testing it. What happens if, let's see, I'm going to mess up my config. If I'm making a change to my config and
We're just seeing the dashboard right now.
oh, thank you.
And James wanted to know if you're spinning these up in Docker.
Not yet. So these things, each one of these has a different way of running. Okay, are you seeing my MAMP Pro?
We're seeing the WP config.
Okay, so this is the editor. Sorry about that. Let me show you how I got there. Inside of MAMP. So MAMP is still a bit of a black box to me. It has its own virtualization layer, and I don't know where like the executable is for these PHP or where these images lie. That's something I need to look into a little bit more. But if I open up the editor, and built into the editor, I made a mistake here. Now when I go to my site, I've got the amazing white screen. That's okay because I'm local and it's just me. I make mistakes in code a lot. Been doing this long enough to make a lot of weird mistakes. I can go back in. And the benefit is I'm not doing this to some client's website. And really, this is where this comes in. If I had a client, I would pull in their site locally and make the changes to it locally and do any tests. Things like when it comes time to upgrade plugins or upgrade versions of PHP, I do that on my own so that I'm not damaging the production site. So MAMP, good, costs money, but lets you do a lot of things, like you can quickly spin up a Drupal site if you want to, or some of these other things. But this one, WordPress 5.6, it'll automatically install and configure it for you. So WAMP is the Windows version. Let me show you local. Local, you can find it at localwp.com. I started using local back when it was in beta a long time ago. One of the main reasons I started using this is I needed a quick way to spin up a dev site and be able to test with the tools that I normally use. I use PHP Storm to develop. I also use VS Code. Local was originally a graphic front end for Docker. Local, the new one, they called it Lightning, and now it's the regular production one. is a little bit different in that it installs all of the tools on your local file system. So it has PHP 5.6, 7.3, 7.4, and 8. And it's installed on your computer in different folders, all with inside the local app. And this is, I'd use on a Mac, but it also is available on Windows. And you can choose between Nginx and Apache. And your MySQL defaults to version 8, but you can do a custom and make it on version 5.7. Overall, local is my favorite tool. So what I've done is, this is the site that is running the slideshow right now. And it gives me access to my database. It comes with adminer, so I can quickly go in and start inspecting my admin database through the browser. It also, if you use SQL Pro or Table Plus, will do one-click connections. So I click, it's automatically configured and opened in the app. And so I can start inspecting data. It has Mailhog, which I showed you before. What Mailhog does is WordPress fires off a lot of admin notices, emails when things go wrong, or updates. With auto updates enabled now, it'll send out notifications. Mailhog acts as a mail server. And as mail comes in, it'll capture it and let you view it in browser. So you're not going to miss anything, especially handy if you're testing email notifications. So if you have a plugin that is testing notifications or relies on emails for like password resets, then you can see what those emails look like, what they're coming from. And if you didn't know, all of the text and subject of email notifications that WordPress sends is all filterable. So if you're writing a plugin that wants to take advantage of those or change the language on that, you can. So MAMP also has Mailhog. Here's my two really geeky things is, like I said, I use PHP Storm and I use VS Code. This is where Xdebug always gave me problems. Setting up the right paths, because when Xdebug is enabled, the module has to be enabled, the software has to be enabled, it has to be turned on, and you have to know where to look for it. I don't anymore. Oh, it doesn't like my file. I can do one click, and now when I open up PHP Storm or VS Code, it's automatically configured to be able to run Xdebug. All I have to do is click in there and it runs. So for example, one thing that I like is if I right click on the site name, it'll let me clone it, export it, which is great for sharing with someone else. I just export it, it creates a zip, and I can send that zip to another teammate and they can start up without having to configure anything. I like my open site shell. It comes with its own version of WP-CLI. When I said before, it installs all of the stuff locally. What it's doing is this shell script is going and opening up the versions of PHP, Nginx, Composer, and all the stuff associated with that, and dropping it right into my environment. It also doesn't like that I have certain WP-CLI stuff. And that's because I'm using version 8 to test right now. And a lot of my code isn't version 8 ready. So right off the bat, if I were to push my stuff into production, it would break my command line on WP Engine. As it is, I can test and say, oh, my code isn't ready yet for version 8. It drops me right into my thing here. And if I do PHP Storm, I don't know if you can see that opening up. Probably not. I'm going to switch my sharing and add So what I did was open up a command line. That command line automatically dropped me into my environment preset. And now, right up here, I have a run debug configuration of local that's already set. I run it, and it's running PHP Storm Xdebug. I have a debug helper that sets the environment so that anything that's listening to it will catch it. And I can say, let's set up a breakpoint. Listen. And it's already mapped. And there's my first breakpoint. So Ryan, that's how I do Xdebug. I don't. I let the tool set it all up for me. I don't have to set up anything. It's just already configured. And if you use PHP Storm or VS Code, one click inside of local, and now I'm stepping through my debugger. And what PHP or what Xdebug does for me is, if you look here, it stopped execution right here. And it lets me already inspect all my variables, the server, everything about every piece of code. I can step through line by line and see how a page load is executed one line at a time. That's huge for me in debugging code, debugging why does that thing have a value? Is it supposed to have that value? Why is it breaking? So Xdebug is my friend, and that's how I set it up. Local does the same thing. I use VS Code, but not super heavily. I know it's becoming very popular for folks. But all I do is add this to the run configuration, and it steps through for me and sets it all up. Another tool is local is connected to WP Engine, to Flywheel. And one of the things that they have is these pro versions. I don't have them, but the idea is you can pull down your site with one click, make your changes to it, and push it right back up. And so if you're the only person working on it and you're okay with not having stuff in Git, then you can. And one of the tools they did is they introduced their image optimizer. I have like 5 different image optimizers that I run in my local sites, and I've got some that I run in production, but it involves having your production server do a lot of work. So this is one way that they're trying to make it possible for people to use it. You download the site, and you'll see I am connected to nothing. But what I would do is I'm connected to my WP Engine account, and I can one-click download any of these sites right into my local, and it's set up right off the bat without me having to do any work. And that means I can test things here before I push them into production. So because I use WP Engine for the past several years, I've been an agency partner. We have our own server. We do all of our work on WP Engine through Big Wing. This has let me quickly create a new site there, come into here, click, download everything locally, click a couple buttons, and immediately start working on it. It also provides SSL and lets me do multi-site. Honestly, it doesn't handle multi-site very well. So multi-site is its own beast. But I can do quick things like switch which version of PHP I'm going to run. And like I said, as I'm doing my testing of, is this going to work? I have PHP 8. Some things aren't going to work. Well, I just switch back to 7.4 and start working again. So local, probably one of my favorites. So part of my new role is I've been with Big Wing for 4 years and now have transitioned to senior developer with Gannett, the newspaper company. We have a couple of groups inside of Gannett. Local IQ is the one that I work with. And we have the majority, and I'm talking about 4,000 sites, of majority of our sites are on Pantheon. And Pantheon is another hosted WordPress and Drupal environment. And it's got a whole lot of stuff that, quite frankly, I don't want to mess with. Pantheon is a big beast. So some things they have is, instead of memcached, they use Redis as their object caching on the back end. They have advanced search through Solr. So similar to Elasticpress or Elasticsearch, Solr is another search engine backend. They have very specific requirements like remote upstreams, they call them. And upstreams are things that you can define and say, we have this blueprint that we're going to use, and every site we want to spin up has one of these blueprints. How do we do that? Well, Lando comes in. It is a front end for Docker Compose. So this is really where we get into Docker. So here's the lando.dev. They're very nerdy. They have a whole lot of stuff that you can do with it, and I'm just barely scratching the surface with it. But remember I said earlier, it's got to have its own stuff, or I'm not going to mess with it. So Lando requires that you have Docker installed, a very specific Docker installed, but it'll work with newer ones. If you don't have it, no worries. It installs it for you, and it walks you through how to create a bunch of stuff. For me, I'm going to show you in Pantheon, we have a bunch of sites. I have Lando installed, and all I need to do is create a folder in Lando init, and it'll ask me a bunch of questions. Cool. What are you trying to start? Well, I want to start a WordPress site. Rock on. Do you want a Pantheon site? No, just WordPress. Or, yeah, I want a Pantheon. Or, no, I want some other type of site. I want a Drupal site. Lando is a nice introduction to the command line because it asks questions as you go. And that has been really nice for me. It's like, cool, what account do you have? What do you want to use for this? What about that? Because we already have a bunch of upstreams, I've got a site that I started on Pantheon. All I have to do is Lando start, and it starts spinning up all the Docker stuff that it needs. I don't have to know how to configure it. I don't have to know how to connect it. And Docker Compose is great if you know how to write it so that it makes all the right connections. I don't do a good job at that. And so Lando, if there's a bunch of stuff that you want, Lando also has a project called Leia, and Leia does all the hard work for Lando. Leia installs all the prerequisites. Leia gets your system ready to run Lando. You don't have to use it if you already have, like, if you like Vim or whatever dev environments you like. So here, I've already done the download of my site on Lando. I start it up and it gives me, oh, look, I'm running Nginx, a server, a database, a caching layer, Edge SSL, Edge server, index server. It's giving me a whole bunch of different configurations and URLs and things to host on. And here's my site. I haven't done anything with it. But it now matches my production site with a simple, it took me all of 5 minutes to configure it and download it and go. If you don't have a remote site, no problem. You can start with any of their commands. So I have, let me show you Lando docs. Lando will show you how to install WordPress. So like here's a recipe for WordPress. It shows you exactly what you need to do. Lando init, config. If you want to get super down and dirty, you can write your own configuration. And here's Xdebug. It'll set it up for you automatically, and it'll just point you to where you need to. This is where sharing things comes in handy. So for local, if I want to share a local config, I create the whole site, I zip it up, and I send an entire zip file over to a coworker. In Lando, if I want to share this environment, I create a single file and I send you a single file. And you take that file, you drop it in a folder, and you Lando start, and it sees that file and says, oh, I know what to do. I'm going to do all these things. So if you want to change your PHP versions, or if you want to make sure that everyone is using the same version, it's great to start out with. But when you do something like this, everyone doesn't have to use the same version. You can say, hey, you test version 7.4, you test version 8. And locally, all they have to do is make change to a single line, Lando restart, and it'll rebuild everything for them. And so they're up and running. So Lando has become my second favorite. What's also nice about Lando, it has its own set of languages, commands, and so for instance, I wanted to run Lando, or I want to find out my WP CLI information. Well, if I'm using Docker, I have to open up a shell into Docker. I have to know what Docker instance is running. I have to know all that stuff. And if I'm using Lando, I do Lando. Well, that's not going to work if I don't type it right. If I prefix something with Lando, it knows which container WordPress is running in, and that automatically goes into that container and runs those commands remotely for me. So it saves me the time of having to know what's running. I can because it is Docker, but I don't have to. And so here, Lando's inside of a container. The nice thing about this is this PHP version is different than the one that I have installed locally. It's different than the one that's right now running on local and MAMP. So right now I have 3 different servers run up with 3 different versions of WordPress and PHP and files, and they're all separated from each other so that they're not going to have any problems fighting, and I'm not going to have conflicts. That is a huge thing for me, to be able to match up remote, but also to be able to do it with a bunch of different tools. A couple others that I'm just going to bounce through. DDEV is very much like local. And I'll have links to these things so you can take some time to read the docs and decide what's going to work for you and try out a bunch of things. DDEV does a very similar thing where it's a front end on Docker Compose. And you can just use Docker Compose. There are already Docker images for WordPress that let you, with a single command, pull Docker, start up WordPress with a MySQL database. And it's for basic development, but you have to be familiar with Docker and know that you're going to be editing files, not on your local file system. The thing about my local setup is the files may live inside of virtual, they may live inside of whatever things, but they're things that I can immediately start typing and changing and testing and writing as I go. So keeping up with prod, the tricks to the keeping up with prod is, here's some good and bad. I love local. Sometimes local doesn't match what the server actually has. And because the PHP versions and the servers are installed directly on the machine, I can't make changes to them to change to match the host. And so there's times that I've written code and it says locally, sorry, we can't build your code because you're missing this module. But I know it exists on WP Engine. I just can't make the change. I have to wait for the developers from local to make the change for me. That sucks. With MAMP, I click a button, hit go, and it adds that module and lets me do it right away. But it doesn't have great access to WP CLI and Xdebug for testing. Lando, I can make all the changes and modules and do everything, but I have to edit a file to do all those things. But it's the closest to letting me actually make my environment exactly match my remote. And that's what I got. There's a whole lot of brain dump. We're at the 12 o'clock mark, so I appreciate y'all time, but I have some time if anyone wants to stick around or chat or not. I don't know what you want to do, but I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Does anyone have any questions? Any local development questions, WordPress questions, whatever? While I am recording this, and so I will have it on Facebook probably today or tomorrow. And so anyone can watch it again if you need to, because that was a whole lot of information. James, I cannot hear you. How do you use Git?
I'll give you a quick overview. Git lets you write your code and commit, and that's just making a copy of your code right now and push it up to a remote repository, something like GitLab or GitHub. Those are a couple of the big common ones. I'll be honest with you, that's a whole lesson in itself. If you go to GitLab.com or GitHub.com, they have tutorials on how to use Git. And there's even one in GitHub that will take you through a tutorial in getting it installed, getting files, making changes, committing, getting to know the language behind it.
I think his question is more how you use it in your workflow.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I use GitFlow. So we have either themes or plugins that I'm writing will have their own repository, and I use GitLab, and every piece of code that I write gets written, gets committed up to its own branch, gets code reviewed and tested. And then when it's ready to merge, I'll let GitLab merge it through the remote. It merges the code into master and automatically triggers a deploy. And GitLab CI/CD, I've written all my deploy scripts where it will then compile all of my source. I don't ever put production assets in there. I put all just source stuff. It'll compile, it'll build everything, test it, and then deploy it off to the remote, usually through FTP or SFTP.